reasons for it. They're both co-located in the insular cortex of the brain. That's what Robert Sapolsky, the neuroendocrinologist, told me. That there are complex reasons as to why we're going to see this rise. And the one group that genuinely knows how to weaponize misinformation about health, that has built scale, that has an understanding of the communications, the technology, has also built sustainable economies based on misinformation, is the anti-vax industry. Now, as it happened, we'd already been studying it for the APPG on vaccines, so we had a baseline analysis of what the quantum was, what the size of the anti-vaccine industry looked like, and their follower base on social media. We then put out the anti-vax industry, the anti-vax playbook, which was based on my team managing to attend a secret conference, the world's leading anti-vaxxers. We recorded them for 3 days, explaining how it was that they were going to weaponize the pandemic again and the vaccine against vaccinations as a whole. And finally, we used the disinformation dozen has clearly, Biden used it to, cited it in evidence when he said that Facebook were killers. And he was right, by the way. That the disinformation dozen it's based on a concentration analysis. Very simply put, in online worlds, it's no real difference to offline worlds. Influence isn't democratically allocated. Not everyone's voice is the same as everyone else's. And we just did a simple, old-fashioned, actually taken from fast-moving consumer goods, so FMCG analysis of what is the concentration of influence. So whose content is driving the most shares online? And we found a nice statistic. 12 people produced 2/3 of the influence, of the shares. Now, there's a little bit of, showmanship, a bit of theatricality in picking 12 and 2/3, but they're memorable. I think nearly everyone's got that statistic right, apart from President Biden, who's used several different shares in his own testimony.
If I may, just on that point, it would seem from what you're saying is that actually finding sources of disinformation on something like anti-vaccine is not difficult to do. It's reasonably predictable where it'll be, and actually it's quite concentrated in the hands of a relatively small number of networks.
Precisely. And, these 12 people have become really good at using different platforms for different reasons. And look, all the platforms are not the same. So there are spaces used to radicalize people. That's Facebook, for example, it's the 800-pound gorilla in the radicalization market. That's true when it comes to violent extremism, just as it is with anti-vax. Why? Because you can bring together large communities of people and then feed them information over time. And frequency bias, which is a psychological trait, is such that if we see something frequently, we think it's normal, we think it's true. It's just really simple. Through using Facebook groups, you can color the lens through which people see the world. So if you drip misinformation into people's feeds on a regular basis into groups, and remembering that last year, Facebook decided to treat groups as friends. So they downgraded news and they upgraded friends, but they made your groups your friends too. So what you get is a higher prevalence of information from within Facebook groups in your feed. And that means that the lens through which you see the world, you see your community, is now infiltrated by bad actors who are spreading misinformation.
So on that, I'd like to bring some other members who's come in with questions as well. What you're saying, it seems to me, is that it's not just that disinformation like anti-vaccine conspiracies, it's not just that it exists on social media, it's not just that it's easy to find and predict. It's not, but the companies, not only do they not act to remove it, they've designed the system that in such a way that it supports the dissemination of that conspiracy theory.
I think that the system they've built is one that is perfect for the dissemination of misinformation that recolors the lens through which people sees the world and leads them down radicalization pathways. But that the bad actors would have done it anyway. And in one part, it's not just about, you've got this ideal system for them. It's also that there are these bad actors that are experts at weaponizing their spaces, and they tolerate their presence. And really the question is, why do they tolerate their presence? And we do have answers to that. Twitter is used for discourse shaping. It's used to target journalists, target politicians, tell them what the acceptable bounds of discourse are until you get abuse. And that has an effect over time. I mean, all of us here at some point will have been abused online, and you know that it gets to you eventually. There's evidence points. YouTube and Facebook and Instagram are used as evidence points. So you put up your evidence there, and then it's fed into other radicalization environments, which are used to contextually reshape the way you see the world. All these platforms come together, it's sort of like Lego, and eventually what you have is a palace that is ideal for bad actors to use.
Darren Jones.
Thank you, Chair. Imran, I'm interested in the identification of the 12 individuals, because often the tech companies will say, well, there's millions of pieces of content. We have warehouses of content moderators, AI systems. It's very difficult to find everything. But you've managed to hone it down to 12 individuals, which makes it sound quite easy to just get rid of them. I mean, presumably they have multiple identities. Is it more than 12? If it's down to 12, why are the companies not dealing with them at the root source?
So, I mean, keeping in mind that Facebook have responded to disinformation dozen now. I think Monica Bickett, 5 months after our report came out, who's their vice president of content policy, and about a month after President Biden had accused them. I'm just trying to find the statistics now that we have on the number of accounts. So those 12 individuals, actually some of them are couples, and behind them are a network of 501c3s, charities, LLCs. They all own companies which have millions of dollars of revenue. These aren't just 12 random members of the public. These are sophisticated bad actors. They have 97 accounts between them. Now, Monica Bickett said, CCDH's research is nonsense because there are lots and lots of people who are spreading misinformation. That's true. But these 12 people are the super spreaders. They're nodes in a network. And online spaces are different. They're not flat spaces. They're hierarchical in terms of who are the key influencers. I have 5,500 followers. If I tweet something, 5,500 people might see it. If they tweet something, a couple of million people might see it because they have far more followers than I do. Of those 97 accounts, only 47 as of right now have been removed. So even though they know the 97 accounts, they failed to take down over half of them. They currently still have 7.9 million followers between the 12 of them. 6.3 million have been taken down. Now, look, that's not bad. I'm glad that 6.3 million followers, that 47 of their accounts have been taken down. I'm very proud that my organization has driven that work. However, the job's not done, clearly. And why they won't take them down. Now, in Monica Bickett's response, she said, we have taken action against all 12 of them, even though CCDH's research is nonsense. Trying to sort of have their cake and eat it too. But at the same time, they haven't taken comprehensive action. So the question is, why not when it is so easy? We've done the hard work of content moderation for them.
Okay, and to me, I mean, this just sounds like an organized crime network.
Yeah.
So what in this bill will stop that from happening?
Well, and look, there is a question here, and there are three things that we've identified as being particularly problematic. First of all, the failure to address hate and misinformation directly on the face of the bill. The second thing is the lack of independence of the audits of social, them marking their own homework, essentially being able to provide that themselves. And that's a real problem. And I'd like to come to that, because I think that this question of how the companies have managed criticism to date, and there has been criticism to date, is really, really vital to this discussion. The third is criminal liability. Now, you would think if the death toll from any terrorist group was hundreds of thousands, as anti-vaccine misinformation has taken lives, there are people that have died as a result of the misinformation they've been fed online. If you speak to NHS workers, they'll tell you that the people that they see that are coming into ICUs now are unvaccinated, and many of them are unvaccinated because they thought that there was a reason not to take the vaccine because of misinformation that they were consuming online, that they didn't have the resilience to challenge and not to accept. And so you would have thought that criminal liability would be a no-brainer here if they continually fail to act. Now, I think what's critical about CCDH is we can prove, both through our experience of negotiating with those companies, working, for example, with Her Majesty's Government, DCMS, on the Counter-Disinformation Task Force, working with the USG, working with other civil society bodies, we can show you that they fail to act in an honest way with those organizations, but also because we've done the independent auditing work to show how their platforms are being abused, and that even when you, for example, send them reports of misinformation, that if you send them using their own reporting tools, in fewer than 8 in 10 instances do they actually take any action. So I think it's 2 in 10 instances that they take action to take down the misinformation that we identify for them. That's a pretty bad strike rate, 2 in 10, you know? So there is clear evidence that these companies aren't actually doing what they need to be doing.
Thank you. Suzanne Weber.
Thank you, Chair. You said very clearly in your view that Facebook are killers, and talked obviously about the online harm, and obviously what we're aware of, that this leads to offline harm, which is of what we just talked about, which is of great concern. You talk about the misinformation, and it's not just about the vaccine. There's misinformation that goes out to young adults, and particularly, and very vulnerable. And often, you know, we hear about the consequences of that. Have we got the evidence of that direct correlation between online harm that can lead to the offline harm?
Well, at a really simple level, yes, and there are going to be, so there's bits of research to connect this all together. Some of it's going to sound ridiculous. So there is actually research that was done, I think it was done by Heidi Larson's group at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, the Vaccine Confidence Project, to show that misinformation misinforms people. Which you would have thought was self-evident, but we've now got the proof that every time someone is exposed to a bit of misinformation, I think it depresses their likelihood to vaccinate by 7.8%. Now, clearly, that if people are misinformed, it is rational for them to come to the conclusion, if they are unresilient to that misinformation, if they trust the material they see online, that they would then not vaccinate. And we have that evidence. So we did correlation analyses, so multiple regression analysis of data that we produced in August 2020 with YouGov. So we asked people if they were likely to vaccinate, and then we asked them a bunch of psychographic questions like, how much media do you consume? What are your attitudes towards scientists, towards government, towards various different figures? Turns out that the best correlator to, and this is across all communities, including African American, Latinx communities in the UK, across Muslim, Jewish, etc. The thing that drives vaccine hesitancy isn't trust in government. That's pretty low everywhere. Trust in scientists is pretty high everywhere. It's trust in social media. It's whether or not someone answers the question. I generally trust what I see on social media. Actually, the best thing that you could do in this pandemic to stop people from believing the material they see on social media is put up a massive banner on the top of every single social media site saying, this site is for entertainment purposes only. You don't know who's put the information that you see here on it. It could be someone that wants to harm you. I did suggest this to Google once, and I think laughingly they decided to, they said that was a good idea, but they never came back to me on it, funnily enough.
Just following on that, in terms of, you mentioned about the criminal liability is the route to go down. I'm guessing if we're looking at the impact of this information being on there, and you know the potential that you're saying is killer, I guess that what we've been looking for is how we can put those two together and correlate to be able to sort of pursue that ourselves. We'd need to have the evidence potentially that was a direct link, if you're going to pursue criminal liability as something that should be included.
And we know, so look, there's both connecting the two things. There's connecting the misinformation to offline harm, and there's myriad ways in which we can do that. I mean, there's soft ways and there's hard ways, and there are things in which that isn't going to be clear. So I mean, when it comes to racism against footballers, you know, I know that Rio Ferdinand is giving evidence later today. I grew up in Old Trafford, so I'm a huge Man United fan. Marcus Rashford is another one of those footballers that's being abused recently. The point that I've made to their representatives and to others is that the reason why the abuse of Marcus Rashford matters, it isn't because they're a wealthy footballer. It's because if they can call Marcus Rashford the N-word, imagine what they call me or my mum or anyone else from a minority, a woman, a gay person, anyone else. That this is a sense of, these places aren't for you. These are our places. And it's literally the counter-enlightenment in play. All those voices, this room here today, which comprises voices which wouldn't have been permitted to sit at these tables 200 years ago, we fought very hard to bring those voices, including mine. They've fought very hard to bring these voices into these rooms, and they're now being excised from an area which is vital to public discourse and democracy. Let's not underplay how important these are. Not entertainment sites. They have become, for better or for worse, critical components in how we communicate information to each other. We create social mores in our society. As I learned when I worked for the Labour Party, seeing the infiltration of anti-Semitism into the Labour Party, that digital spaces were being used as the space in which those social mores and values were evolving.
Thank you. Libby Abrahams.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming here today. You mentioned in your introduction in terms of the rise of misinformation and how that was used within the US presidential election. And I noticed in one of your blogs earlier this year, you reported that Gateway Pundit had earned over $1 million in Google ad revenue in that election. But that particular website between November and January claimed that the US election had been stolen from Donald Trump.
Yes.
Resulted in 50 million visits, nearly a billion clicks from that. And of course, they also promoted the meeting and the rallies on the 6th of January. What do you think, in terms of the scope of the bill, is contained around potential harms? So is there a responsibility of not just direct individual harm, but potential harms? And also, how does the bill address not just individual harm, but societal harm as well?
So this is another problem with the bill, is that it does not deal with the advertising market. So Google has two parts to its advertising business. The first part is it has a display network and it has websites. About a third of all ads revenues, digital ads revenues, Google has. But 95% of the sites that you ever see that have ads on them have ads placed there by Google. So they've chosen breadth over sort of expense. And they have an enormous display network, and what they do is they gobble up sites and they put them in there, including Gateway Pundit, which was spreading election misinformation, the big lie, COVID disinformation, all sorts of malignant and anti-Black narratives, and really horrific racist nonsense. We identified that they earned, thanks to that Google Ads monetization, which take advertising revenue from, I think on Gateway Pundit, we actually found Democratic Party adverts placed on Gateway Pundit, a viciously far-right site, which just goes to show that even for the advertiser, it's a terrible waste of money. And most of them are utterly frustrated when they find out about it. That Google has become a primary funder of malignant, violent, racist, anti-Semitic content on the internet. COVID disinformation. I can give you one example of a site that I think I first heard about through Home Office Counterterrorism. And that site we targeted last year, it was covered in adverts for household brands. And we contacted each of those brands. We got all their adverts taken off. The site shut down after the ads disappeared. It just goes to show you that the advertising revenue from Google was vital to the proselytization of hatred into our society, where counterterrorism were telling us that they were concerned about it. Gateway Pundit. So they raised millions of dollars of revenue from Google Ads, and 1.1 million just in 7 months. I'm very proud to tell you that our campaign Stop Funding Misinformation, that story was actually featured in Forbes magazine in the US. I think it was last weekend. Google took them off their display network after a year of campaigning by CCDH, and they are now demonetized, which means that they will not be able to spread their nonsense any further, or with the scale and speed that they were able to before. And that's another thing that I'm very proud of my team for.
Thank you. Eben Kidron.
Yes. Imran, I have two questions really, and one is about responsibility and one is about intentionality. So I was really interested when the chair asked you a question and sort of said, is it set up to spread this bad stuff? And you actually were quite careful and you sort of backtracked and said, no, actually, it's a perfect environment. So I think I'd like you to tell the committee, given that you're our first witness, should we be looking at the intention and unintentional consequences of this system? Is that one of the things we need to do?
So I'm always really cautious when it comes to ascribing the reasons for harm. When I'm asked about the disinformation dozen, and the most frequent question I get asked is, are they doing this on purpose? Are they doing this for the money? And I say, I cannot tell you what resides in the hearts of people, but I can tell you it's curious how much money they make from spreading disinformation. And so I would say the same about the executives of these companies. However, they know, they have been told many, many times, not just by us, civil society, not just by governments, but also internally by their own staff. Shira Frenkel's marvelous new book on Facebook shows you the extent to which there is internally, there are people pushing back saying, please, we need to do something about these harms. I can tell you right now that I speak to people inside these companies, and they are frustrated at the fact that their executives know about this and are doing little about it. We have worked with, on the DCMS counter disinformation task force set up around COVID. I mean, that was 4 civil society, so 4 charities or non-profit NGOs, a few academics, some civil servants, ministers, and the companies. And we were giving them all the data. We were telling them what was going on. There was one point at which I think Facebook's representative thanked us all for the work that we'd done identifying the problems on their platform. And I'm because I'm pokey, I poked back and said, we have hundreds of thousands of dollars of revenue between the 4 organizations. You have billions. Why on earth aren't you doing this work for yourself? And in one respect, they've both not bothered doing the work because if they did, they'd have moral culpability. But also that when they are told about it, they don't do anything about it either.
I'm going to press you a little bit because I think when I talk about intention versus unintentional, so they are very keen on freedom of expression, but you have actually just said to the committee that some people are being frozen out. So that unintentional consequence of their freedom of expression desire is having this negative. I'm saying to you, is the job of the online safety bill to actually really take a societal look at that and say, in the UK, this is what we think good looks like? Because there are many and complicated balances that we have to look at. And I'm just interested in the unintentional ones.
I feel like the answer is in the question to some extent. Yes, of course. We need to take a broad look at the harms created by these platforms, both intentional and unintentional. But also the way in which rights, I would argue the freedom of speech thing is a defensive play by the companies, sort of first year PPE, I call it, by them on, freedom of speech is absolute. And of course, these aren't platforms that are all about freedom of speech. These aren't public squares. Their algorithms mean that they pick winners and losers in the content game. The spreaders of hate and misinformation are able to bully their opponents off that space to narrow the space in which their opponents can operate. The prevalence of hate speech and misinformation damages free speech in other ways. You haven't got free speech if you're a black footballer and 100 racist people jump down your throat every time you post. In fact, the barrier to entry for you to using this vital tool for promoting your brand, for transacting business, is taken away from you. But also, I mean, more fundamentally, I've always felt it remarkable that the companies have been able to get away with the first time I've heard anyone accuse the companies of being responsible for the harms they create. It was when President Biden called them killers. And I mean, I've been arguing this with executives there for quite some time, that at what point is there culpability? If you know there's harm being created by your product, what other industry gets away with this?
Can I finish with this then, just about responsibility, because you've taken me right there, which is in your evidence. You say, disappointingly, platforms have increasingly passed the burden of dealing with trolling onto individual users through features to filter abuse. would you be disappointed in a bill that gave them the responsibility to create user tools? And do you think it needs to be upstream, the sorts of response the bill should be having to create safety? I mean, is it with them or is it with the user? I
mean, it's outrageous to literally tell Black, gay, women, it's not just about minorities, it's also about, like, I've been advising scientists who've been working on the vaccine, who've been getting unbelievable amounts of abuse about the fact that they are trying to put microchips in people or nonsense like that, threatening their families. In fact, I'm not meant to talk about the threats that CCDH gets, but I can tell you the anti-vaxxers give better death threats than anyone else. They're very good fun, they're completely bananas. There are so many organizations which are being bullied off those platforms, and I think it's a really important component of it. I mean, I would make this point as well, that when it comes to the free speech debate, we track the litigation that these companies put in. So when it comes specifically to the First Amendment question in the US, the companies, when they're in litigation, when they're being sued by, for example, members of the Disinformation Dozen or by hate actors. So publicly, the hate actors say, if we lose our platform, we'll go somewhere else. And publicly, Facebook say, well, they kind of have a First Amendment right to say what they want to say. In the litigation, the hate actors say it's destroyed our business. So one of them said it demolished his ability to spread misinformation. Another one said that it destroyed his business, the economics behind it. Because, of course, in the courts, they have to prove tort. So they have to lay out what the harm is. And the companies say, they don't have a First Amendment right. This is our platform. We have the First Amendment right. No court can tell us what to put on our platform. And this guy's an idiot. So sling one.
Thank you.
Tim Clement-Jones.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of questions. Very powerful testimony on misinformation, disinformation, Imran. And you've mainly talked about Facebook and Google. And I wondered if, in a sense, this was absolutely right across the board, this kind of behavior that you've been describing, or failure to act, is common right across the board on the platforms, or whether there is any of the social media platforms or search platforms have best practice. Is there anything that one can draw upon for the purposes of the future code? And then I think the secondary question there is whether we should be making a distinction in terms of misinformation, disinformation spreading between the larger platforms and the smaller ones, as the bill does.
Well, look, there are rational reasons for splitting out the larger platforms from the smaller platforms. And ironically, the ones that like to talk most about the impact on smaller platforms are the larger platforms, which are trying to cover up their central role in the spreading of disinformation and hate throughout our societies. I think that we're going to struggle with this bill to find the right balance between the prescriptions that need to be put into place for large companies and small companies. And I think that like the Disinformation Dozen, you should focus as much as possible on where the greatest quantum of harm is caused. And the greatest quantum of harm is caused by Twitter, which is vital in the shaping of discourse, on Google, which owns both YouTube, which is which is one of the most resistant platforms to taking action to enforce their own rules. And keep in mind that one of the cute things that the team does at CCDH is that we always measure up the content that we're looking at by their own rules. We look at the enforcement of their own rules. And one of the things I would urge is that, at the moment, the decision-making by companies, the transparency of how they enforce their rules just is severely lacking. And there is, in one respect, a very easy solution that would work in both the UK and the US and some of the other jurisdictions we work on. It's that if there was transparency of enforcement and how they enforce their rules, if there's transparency of algorithms and how they decide what wins and what loses on their platform, and if there's transparency of the economics of the advertising market, of other aspects of how they generate their wealth, their immense wealth, you could get most of the way to a solution that would make it impossible for them to function as they are right now, with the arrogant insouciance, the lack of transparency, and their ability to turn around to governments and go, that's not the way it works, you don't know the way it works, only we know the way it works. And of course, that's part of their playbook. So I think that there are various aspects of this bill. This is a really, and one of the hardest things about this bill is, as the Carnegie Trust have said very clearly, this is a really complicated bill. And I don't envy you having to get your heads around every single clause and subclause and power within it. The question isn't necessarily, are there going to be sufficient powers? And I think we've identified some areas in which there aren't sufficient powers on the fact independence of audits, hate and misinformation being clear on the face of the bill, criminal liability. But the question is whether or not the regulator is going to be able to wield those powers with sufficient confidence and effectiveness to give us the results socially that we want.
It sounds as though algorithmic inspection is a really important part of what you're suggesting in terms of transparency.
We put out a report a few months ago called Malgorithm, which looked at the way the algorithm works. So I think it was September 2020, when Facebook bought Instagram, they said that they wouldn't Facebookize Instagram. That was their promise to the founders. And the founders of Instagram then left because Facebook, of course, then Facebookized Instagram. In August, September 2020, they decided to change the algorithm that ran on the front page of Instagram. So it used to be that if you got to the end of your feed, it would say, well done, you've caught up. Now it started recommending you posts that you should read. So we thought it's a great opportunity to find out how it recommends things. So we set up a series of different accounts, each of which followed only 10 accounts, each an archetype. So one was following health authorities, one was following wellness accounts, one was following anti-vaxxers, one was following anti-Semites, one was following QAnon. And we saw what recommendations came out. In short, if you follow wellness, it would feed you anti-vax. If you followed anti-vax, it would give you QAnon. If you feel anti-Semitism, if you followed QAnon, it would give you anti-vax and COVID disinformation. We found the algorithm, whether it's by design or by experience of trillions of clicks, had realized that conspiracist information is addictive and it keeps people on platform. If you can deepen and broaden people's conspiracism and their extremisms, you can keep them on platform for ages, because where do you go for misinformation and conspiracy? You go to their platforms. So they create a captive audience. And why do they do that? Because eyeballs equals ad revenues equals more money for them. And that's all and in reality, I think the algorithms will end up being very simple. They just say, what do I have to do to keep people on this platform for as long as possible to make as much money as possible? And once that is genuinely known, once people genuinely understand both the simplicity of those algorithms, the failure to act on malignant content, and the impact on our societies, I don't think it would survive anyway in the condition that they are at the moment.
Thank you. A quick final question, Chair. Following up what Debbie had to say on societal harms, and if you go for that, it doesn't have to just be an individual harm. How on earth do you define a societal harm for the purposes of the bill?
Well, luckily that's not my job. I look forward to seeing your solution on it. Look, I think that you're going to have to take a very broad view of societal harm. You've got later on today my friend and colleague Danny Stone from the Anti-Semitism Policy Trust. There is a price that is incredibly clear and a harm that is incredibly clear that comes with misinformation and hate.
What you're saying from your responses there would seem to be that if someone starts engaging with a certain type of conspiracy theory, they will see others on different topics.
They'll be fed others. I was told by the civil service that the one report Facebook really pushed back on by CCDH was Malgorithm. Not Disinformation Dozen, not any of the others. That's the one they really pushed back on. And I was delighted when the civil servant said that he'd turned around to Facebook and said, well, perhaps you're right. Perhaps CCDH are wrong about how your algorithm works. But there is evidence that there is harm, because it's clear they've got screenshots. So perhaps that's a good chance for us to have an independent inspection of how your algorithm works. And I thought that was a very clever answer.
You can see why they would push back on that, because rather than blaming someone who's posting bad content, you're blaming their system as being the problem. John Nicholson.
Thank you, Chair. Why do you think it is that people choose to believe disinformation rather than their doctor?
Well, I mean, so there are lots of different reasons. It's access as well. So as anything else, that in the middle of a pandemic, we've been physically dislocated from GP surgeries. That we've had. Where's the information that we've seen been coming in from? We've been stuck at home. We've been stuck behind computers. Those computers have been giving us. 2020 has shown, the scale of disinformation on these platforms, but also the power of social media. And I never want to discount that. I moved to DC in July 2020. The social media is the main way in which I expressed vulnerability, gained succor, felt love from my friends, saw things which were important to my life. And in amongst that, I know that there was vast amounts of misinformation flowing. So it's the prevalence of it. It's the centrality of these platforms as a means of communication, and the fact that they are inherently, irredeemably laced with misinformation. That one of those primary information environments that we exist in is laced with misinformation. That's one reason. The other reason is that, so there are psychological correlators for why people believe misinformation rather than good information or information from health authorities. And don't forget, the UK has done pretty damn well when it comes to vaccination compared to the US. Why is that? In part because we have an institution in the UK that commands more trust than the US health system has. We have the NHS. And this is about, it's epistemic authorities. It's about who has the right to tell you what the truth is or not. And in the UK, the NHS is trusted and loved by most people, and so therefore it's done pretty well. What drives conspiracist thinking, epistemic anxiety? A lack of knowledge about not just what the truth is, but how to find the truth.
Are there any, in your opinion, are there any people who are particularly susceptible as groups to the disinformation? Because, for those of us who've grown up getting jags in our arms as babies, we've believed the National Health Service. We've believed that inoculations, jags is a Scottish usage. We believe that we'll be kept safe by inoculations. Why would we suddenly turn around and believe some random on Facebook rather than a health service we've trusted our whole lives, taking your point that it's less prevalent here than elsewhere?
What we're talking about, though, is 60 million people follow spaces which are controlled by anti-vaxxers on social media. That number hasn't changed over the pandemic, by the way. For all the action they claim to have taken, there are still 60 million people following these spaces. It went up by about 10 million at the start of the pandemic. And so what we've seen is it's not a symmetrical question. It's not about people either believe in vaccines or they don't believe in vaccines. They're hesitant. If I saw children are important to me, something I'd like in my future. If someone said to me that this jab might cause harm to a child, I would be horrified. I'd stop for a second. I think, well, crumbs, I don't really want to do that. It's about making people pause. Vaccine hesitancy. So many of the people in those hospitals gasping for breath right now who are inflicted with COVID did it because they were waiting to see if the vaccine was dangerous. That's what they were really doing. It's vaccine hesitancy, not being anti-vax. And it's an asymmetric battle. We are actually the change agents. We're telling people, get off your bums, go to the doctor, go and get your jab. That's the change state, right? They're just saying, don't, just sit there. Keep watching Netflix.
What's the motivation of the anti-vaxxers?
If you can divorce people from so anti-vaxxers are like any type of groomer or recruiter. And you can look at, say, the way that AQ used to recruit, or Hezbollah, or also the way in which child sexual exploitation works. This is about making people not trust the authorities that they normally trust. Anti-vaxxers only have 3 actual messages. Forget all the sort of the nonsense about memes. Look at the themes. COVID isn't dangerous. Vaccines are dangerous or unsafe, or there's something funny about them. And therefore, the people pushing those 2 things, the doctors, they can't be trusted because they're compromised. There's only 3 messages in there. And I think it's the simplicity of what they have to communicate that actually make, and we have failed on multiple levels. We've done things like engage with individual memes, actually giving oxygen to the idea that microchips are in the vaccines, or we've given oxygen to nonsense that, hydroxyquinolone, that now ivermectin. I keep being asked by US media people to do stuff on ivermectin. I say, I absolutely refuse to do it. I don't want to talk about it. That's not what this is about. This is about telling people that you don't need to go and get the vaccine. You could just take some horse tranquilizer.
And what's the battle plan, do you think, of the platforms long term to keep going? Because I was quite interested, because I also sit on the DCMS committee, and we had a boss of TikTok in front of us. And their argument was that they take down COVID disinformation. And we said, you clearly don't. And my office staff managed to find a very glamorous young woman who was pushing COVID disinformation. And she had more than 100,000 hits for this COVID disinformation, saying you're injecting yourself with babies. Now, what was interesting was that the TikTok boss who appeared before us didn't offer free speech defense, didn't say, well, she's entitled to put out the message if that's what she wants to. It's all about free speech. Their argument was this is absolutely horrific, and we do everything possible to take this stuff down. Yeah. Clearly not the case. So are they operating different defenses simultaneously, both the free speech defense and the we are completely incompetent defense?
So free speech is an earlier part of their playbook. They have a playbook. There's 4 Ds. Deny, initially. So initially they said that anti-vax stuff, it's not causing a big problem. And it's not against our rules anyway. Don't forget, anti-vax misinformation was at the start of the pandemic, not against Facebook's rules. It's only at Christmas time when there was a huge amount of attention as a result of multiple organizations, including CCDH with the anti-vax playbook, showing how the platforms were being abused by anti-vaxxers, that they changed their policy on that. So initially you deny. Second, you deflect. You say, lots of people feel this way. This is a societal problem. This isn't about what's happening on our platform. Even though there are no water coolers anymore, in the last year, this has been a perfect experiment. And if information was ordered by Mark Zuckerberg, what would the world look like? Turns out it's, domestic terrorism at the Capitol and people choking to death in ICUs. The third phase is delay. So that once they've accepted responsibility and they said, we're going to do something about it, they say, absolutely, we're going to do something really big about this, but we can't do it all at once. I mean, how on earth can we do that? So they say, we'll deal with it, but they always delay and delay and delay. And the reason why they detest us, which I'm very, which I know is true, is because we expose how severe that delay is and the impact of that delay, their failure to act, even when they accept that they must act. And then finally, they throw dollars at it. So deny, deflect, delay, and then dollars. And look, the dollars are a big issue. In 2020, Amazon and Facebook spent twice as much as Exxon and Philip Morris on lobbying. Big tech spent $120 million on lobbying in just 2020, in the election year. 94% of Congress with jurisdiction over privacy and antitrust have received money from a big tech corporate PAC. In the UK, I can tell you that I go to meetings in which I see civil society bodies who come out against a CCDH position. I always go back and check who their funders are, and I always find big tech among their funders. The tentacles of big tech are everywhere. A question you should be asking everyone that submits evidence to you is, do you take money from big tech? Because I'm going to dinners, to lunches, to debates every day in which I'm dealing with organizations that are essentially bought part and parcel of the big tech lobbying machine. And that's what you're up against. It's a truly courageous sales that you're taking on for that reason, because you're coming up against the most powerful, impressive lobbying machine assembled in history. There's a reason why Facebook keeps putting adverts in the New York Times, full page ads saying, we're ready for Section 230 reform of the Communications Decency Act, which gives them no liability for the content on their platforms. It's because they know this is coming. They're ready for it. They've got some of the finest political minds in the world working on it, and Nick Clegg too.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dean Russell.
Thank you, Chair. Just wanted to touch on a couple of points. You mentioned right at the start, you gave 3 examples of big issues, anti-vax being one of them, the awful incidents in the Capitol in Washington. How are these connected? I mean, are you finding that actually the same organizations are actually spreading misinformation in different ways to the same groups of people and perhaps trying to widen that audience?
I mean, this is one of the things that the serious part of the job where we talk to counterterrorism in the US and UK is convergence and hybridization of these forces. So one of the problems with the problem with social media is that it's zero marginal cost for each additional communication to each additional person. The actual fundamental technical change to how communications happens in the economics of it is enormous. It's like the nuclear bomb. It's unlimited amounts of energy from zero. And so if you can communicate to theoretically 4.5 billion people for zero cost, you're able to market to new groups. What we've seen over the pandemic is the cross-marketing of different types of extremism to each other. And that leads to convergence. So on January the 6th, we had a stage which had anti-vaxxers, the Oath Keepers, the far-right white supremacist group. We had George Papadopoulos, Roger Stone, a whole sort of array of bad guys on that one platform. They'd converged in physical space after initially converging and marketing to each other, realizing that there was an opportunity to sell the same idea that you can't trust the government, that they're out to get you, that there's a great big conspiracy. What we're seeing now is hybridization. So once you form these converged new organizations, you see mega conspiracies being used to hybridize them. So QAnon brought together suburban moms with white supremacists, with Trump supporters, with a whole array of people who were just worried about children. The new one is the Great Reset, which is replacing QAnon. And QAnon is basically dead. QAnon minus the pedophile weirdness and Donald Trump being the world's greatest pedophile hunter, and instead with the idea that the vaccines are being used to kill people. That's the Great Reset conspiracy theory, which is now the mobilizing conspiracy theory behind the eruptions of violence that we're seeing in real life today.
Thank you. And with regards to that then, you mentioned earlier about this huge amounts of money here that's being funded into these conspiracy creators, as it were. Where's that money coming from? You mentioned earlier, you said about bad actors, as it were, and you mentioned charities, you mentioned business. Interestingly, you didn't say the word governments, and I just wonder, is there a bigger issue here around security globally?
So, I mean, we don't do government work. We're not a quasi or semi or in any way espionage agency. We don't take money from governments either, to be very clear, nor do we take it from big tech. So we aren't equipped and we aren't capable of identifying infiltration by governments. Part of the reason for that is that the people that have access to IP level data that you would need to understand it and to look at masking, for example, are the companies themselves, and they have teams internally to do that. Part of the reason is it's just not our wheelhouse. There are organizations like ISD, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, run by Sasha Havlicek, which is an incredible organization. They're very good at that, and they work with governments and with DHS and others to do that sort of work. But I mean, the way I've always explained it is, it's a no-brainer. Look, if you want to kill British people or American people, the best thing you could do now is, if you're a Russian tech person, is go and like the posts of bad actors from within our society. So it's injecting heat into an existing fissure in our society, trying to cause an earthquake.
And if I may, just on the pool of people you mentioned earlier, I think 60 million has been a sort of standard amount of people that are following the anti-vax conspiracy theories, as it were. I used to do a lot of work in AI and psychology AI before becoming an MP, and the use of language, the way that things are phrased, can have a powerful impact on what people believe and their actions. Are those 60 million the same, and are they all sort of people who watched the X-Files TV show and thought it was a documentary, or is it the reality that that they're changing and swapping and changing? Actually, the language that's being used and spread by these platforms is actually convincing people that previously perhaps wouldn't have been convinced about conspiracies and about misinformation.
Yeah, and they use really sophisticated tools to bring them in. I mean, propaganda works. There's a reason why we study propaganda. But they're in, for example, the anti-vaxxers talks about creating answering spaces, so waiting for people to express anxiety and then jumping on them with a bit of misinformation that bridges them into. And the disinformation does are worthwhile looking at for so many reasons, but one of them is that they're comprised, like an industry, they each have a different brand and market. So one of them will target sort of, moms who are into yoga and wellness in California. One will target Trump voters. One will target another segment. And they have both the bridging identity and the bridging arguments to draw people into extremisms.
And just finally from me, if I may, Chair, just related to that, are you finding in your algorithms reports and so on, are those algorithms seemingly targeting more vulnerable people in society?
Look, if there's 60 million people across the US and UK who are following spaces, then this isn't about vulnerable or not vulnerable. This isn't about smart or stupid. It isn't about race. Smart people are just as vulnerable to conspiracy theories for a variety of reasons, not least of all because they're more confident that they know what the truth is once they've worked out what they think the truth is, that they're using the evidence in front of them. So being clever isn't resilience enough. You need to do some work to remove the content itself. And the platforms are feeding that content in. When I'm in rooms full of smart people, I always ask the question, what vegetable helps your eyesight? And everyone always goes, carrots. And I remind them that was Ministry of Information and Propaganda during the Second World War to hide the fact that we had plane-mounted radar. So we told people that we'd been growing carrots and feeding it to our pilots so they could see at night. But even now, are any of you going to go ahead and, I do this, then my favorite thing to do is follow up with a question asking, well, now that you know that it's just propaganda, are you still going to tell your kids to eat carrots? And everyone goes, yeah.
So the kids aren't listening, Imran. Jim Knight.
Thank you. In your evidence, you talk about the bill failing to address the harms caused by online advertising and go on to talk about your report on that and campaign on that. What would you like the bill to do in respect of online advertising, and why wouldn't we have the Advertising Standards Authority regulate that?
I mean, I'm not sure whether or not this is within the scope of the bill, advertising at all. And I know that there are other things going on in government, and I've spoken to civil servants about that, and they assure me that things are going to happen on advertising. There's one simple answer. So I talked about transparency earlier and about, I like freedom of speech. I'm a lefty. I believe that everyone should have the right to say what they think. And I think that the platforms should be more transparent, not less transparent. There should be more speech when it comes to algorithms, to enforcement, and to the economics of those organizations. If every single advertiser knew where their adverts were appearing and had to, for example, publish it on a page on their website, then my team wouldn't have to go and identify to them that their ads were appearing on malignant content sites, because Google would have to tell them, which they're very slow at doing, where their ads are really appearing, and they're sort of through networks of intermediaries. So let's just say we had a law in the UK where every single brand on their website, in the same way that I have to publish my registered address on my website and who the company is for, had to just have a page where you could see where their ads appear. It would clean up the problem immediately, because no one would want to advertise on a malignant content site. And you would give the tools to civil society to do the right job. So that's a very, very, very quick and smart solution. You could call it the Stop Funding Misinformation Amendment, but that would quickly fix this bill and end in one fell swoop the way that Google Ads funds malignant content that causes so much harm to our society.
And the ASA and how that might relate to Ofcom? You mentioned that in your evidence.
Do I think the agencies as they're equipped right now? Clearly not, because we haven't been doing a great job at actually identifying the way in which malignant content has been used today. I mean, this hasn't been on their radar. I get more interest from companies themselves. I'm actually speaking at the Adweek conference in a few months to talk about exactly this, asking companies to take responsibility for where their ads appear and what content they appear. The problem is that if you've bought a package of 500,000 eyeballs, You don't, you know, you just want the eyeballs.
And they're algorithmically placed in themselves, those ads.
Absolutely. Programmatic advertising, they call it. But what it means is an abrogation of their responsibility to ensure they're not funding bad content. And it means that every time you go and buy, you know, something from the supermarket, you're inadvertently, by accident, thanks to Google, funding election misinformation that leads to riots, to COVID misinformation that leads to death.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. I wholly agree with you that actually the best single thing we could do is actually introduce transparency into the ad supply market. And I think it would be very useful if you had any ideas about how the bill could be amended to let the committee have that, especially if it's a simple amendment. I just wanted to ask, on the subject of regulators, whether you think Ofcom is the right regulator, and if so, are the powers that are given to it under the bill sufficient?
So there are things missing from their powers, and there are things that have been passed on to Ofcom, for example, having to decide whether or not to introduce or to recommend criminal sanctions. There are the fundamental thing to me is whether or not they have the power to commission independent audits that can go into the companies and check if what they're giving us is true, but also the missing statistics. You know, one of the questions we ask all the time is, how much of the hate identified do you take down? And they always come back and give us the non sequitur statistic. 90% of the information we take down is detected by algorithms before it even hits the site. That's not what I asked. It's not the question. I mean, that there are a number of things that we've been incapable of getting at them. So Ofcom's ability to commission that independent data. But I think in part there is a question of whether or not they're going to be able to knit together confidently the mix of civil society, of their regulatory powers of government, of criminal sanctions, to hold these companies accountable. And my fear is that they will be treated with the same contempt that, for example, the FSA was by investment banks in the early noughties and late 90s, which is that they will never have the scale of powers required, nor will they be confident enough to wield them to protect society from the harms being created on these platforms.
Yeah. That point about independent audit is absolutely crucial. Do you think the bill, as it stands, does that?
No, it doesn't. It needs independent auditing powers in there. It needs the ability to go in and get other bodies, not just self-reporting. You cannot ask Facebook to mark their own homework. That's why we are where we are. Self-regulation is over. It's got to be over. And the funny thing is that I keep being told that this sort of regulation can't happen anywhere in the world. I keep being told it can't happen in the US. But I've got a solid bet that it's one of those things where everyone's telling you in advance why it can't happen. And then once it does happen, they'll be telling you why it was inevitable that it was going to happen.
That's one important recommendation.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Stephen Gilbert.
Give us the bills quickly, marks out of 10 for dealing with any of the issues you've described.
I love a reductive statistic, which is why we wrote the disinformation dozen, but I don't want to mark Her Majesty's government. I think that it is, so let's start at the beginning. It is the most ambitious legislation anywhere in the world. It is a phenomenal display of confidence and strength as the UK legislating, and better or for worse, it's an independent Britain. We're able to put together our own regulation when it comes to social media. And I think that the whole of the world is looking to the UK right now. The whole of the world is looking to this committee. I know there are colleagues in the US right now who are doing a 5 a.m. watch party of this particular session to see what's happening. So this is really, really important what's happening here. And the bad guys are watching too. You know, in one respect, my job is split between, I think of the bad guys as being, I can't change a Nazi. So my job is to disrupt their work. My job with the companies is to make them take responsibility, because they're not Nazis. They're not anti-vaxxers. They are actually rational people. And it's like anything, with any industry, think of the industry as amoral and gaseous. It will expand to fit whatever framework you put around it. We've just got to make sure that we're starting to put some sort of regulatory framework to give them the boundaries of what we consider to be acceptable. And it is actually our fault for having failed. The US literally legislated to create no liability whatsoever for social media companies for any of the content posted on their site, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, an act in retrospect of such enormous naivety. Because if you remove the framework, what you get is the companies racing to the bottom. And what we need to do is give them the framework so they know, well, these are our expectations of society. It's actually the decent thing to do.
Okay, so we're sending a very powerful signal, and you think in many ways we are taking a lead. Can we just have a look at how the provision is going to work? Because you said it was a very complicated bill. It is a very complex bill, and it's a lot of work needs to be done on the drafting to make it simpler. But it does three basic things. It puts a series of duties of care on platforms to protect children from harmful content. We haven't discussed that today, and I think that's more relevant for other witnesses. To remove illegal content, and quite a lot of the stuff you've been talking about today is illegal content, not all of it, quite a lot of it is. And to protect adults from content that is legal but harmful. And it does that by putting a duty on the companies to have a look at how their systems work, identify potential problematic areas, and put in place a policy to deal with them. And all of that responsibility is on the companies. It's overseen by Ofcom, but its responsibility is on the companies. It seems to me that nothing much changes, that the companies will decide what's harmful. Maybe there's some change in terms of illegal content. Maybe we will be able to ensure that companies take down illegal content much faster, and Ofcom will be on that case. But it seems to me there's no change at all in relation to harmful content. It will be defined by companies. Their policy for dealing with it could be not to deal with it, and as long as they're open and transparent about it, nothing has changed.
I mean, you're absolutely nailing the problem, the problem with the powers and the framework. That, first of all, the lack of that, you're asking the companies to mark their own homework, but you're also in one respect, asking them to set their own rules and set the test itself. And that is deeply problematic. As it happens, when it comes to setting the test, their rules for the main part are incredibly fair and stringent. I mean, they do ban disinformation, they ban lies about vaccines, they ban hatred, but they just don't enforce them. So there's an enforcement thing, and CCDH has tended to focus on the failure to act and not on policy development. My colleagues like Danny Stone have been incredibly powerful in forcing them to evolve their policies, working with them from the inside and getting them to see dehumanizing behaviors, for example, another form of hatred. But I've got to be honest that I am frustrated by this, because I know that civil society are the ones who've driven them to the position they're in now, but we need to hand the baton off to government, to legislators, because we cannot keep absorbing the cost. I mean, that's why companies are taking money from Facebook and Google, because it's expensive. I mean, I've got 14 members of staff. How do you think we pay for them? It's hard work, and it's not glamorous or well-paid work either. The second thing is that we also have to take the threats. So I think I alluded to death threats and things like that. But I mean, for example, right now, CCDH is coping with the fact that we have been we've been sued by one of the disinformation dozen, who's accused us not of defamation, but of something quite extraordinary, of breaching their right to a reputation as part of their private life under EU human rights legislation. But it's costing us thousands of pounds, of course, to defend that, because we have to defend it as serious things. We have felt abandoned by government, which is it's convened things, but hasn't given itself the powers nor taken the responsibility of doing what has to be done. I can, with the indulgence of the committee, I could submit as written evidence some of the examples of the sorts of threats that civil society have had to endure, including the legal threat from this member of the disinformation dozen. So you can see what it is that is happening as a result of the failure of government to act to date.
Okay, the bill is also full of quite vague definitions. So a content that is harmful to adults isn't defined. It's not clear who should define it. You said that you didn't want to get involved in defining societal harm, and I'm sure many other people wouldn't. The bill leaves most of this to platforms. Who should who should make these definitions? Who should create the framework? Should it be platforms? Should it be Ofcom? Should it be the Secretary of State, or should it be Parliament?
My Lord, I'd like to see it on the face of the bill. I think these things should be put on the face of the bill. I think your definitions of hate and misinformation and the fact that they're covered by this bill should be on the face of it. I think the definition of the harms that are being addressed, there needs to be flexibility, obviously, to have them added in. But the system as it exists now of not having that clarity, the less clarity there is, the actual harder it is on those companies to do the right thing, and the more wiggle room there is for them to escape from it. And they will escape from it. They'll always be probing the edge of the legislation, and they have the best lawyers, they have the best public affairs, they have the best public relations. If you're in DC and you're trying to find a law firm to represent you, which we had to do, finding one that doesn't have a conflict of interest because they also act for one of the big tech companies is near impossible. So I think we've ended up with one of the only 2 or 3 firms in which you can actually have them represent you if you take on big tech.
Thank you. Final question from Darren Jones.
Thank you, Chair. Just a very quick supplementary following your discussion earlier on the exclusions for paid for advertisements. I'm interested in this definition that we discussed earlier between an individual posting something and organised criminals posting things. Presumably, organised criminals will just pay for their advertisements in order to get through a loophole in the bill here. And if you agree with that, from your study, do you know how much of the content you reviewed was already paid for advertisements?
Some was. So anti-vaxxers were able to advertise on their platforms until mid last year. A lot of the election misinformation is paid ads. We've got a report coming out next week on paid ads that we've seen on the platforms that do something really, really horrific. It is one of the most challenging pieces of research we've ever put out in terms of the content that they accepted money for paid ads for. But yeah, dealing with transparency, then they currently have some degree of transparency with their ad library, but as usual, it's unwieldy. They make the way in which you interface with their transparency mechanisms as complex as possible. So there's a tiny technical, really nerdy issue here that we should also, when you're defining what their transparency looks like and determining their APIs, the way in which you interface with their platforms at a technical level and are able to draw the information out of their systems, and the flexibility you have to combine data to have compound variables as well as just variables that you're looking at is really important.
So exclusions for paid for advertisements is a problem?
Of course.
Thank you.
Bananas.
Thank you. Imran Ahmed, thank you very much for your evidence.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
What's happening
What's going his charger?
Good morning. Thank you to the members of the second panel for joining us for this evidence session. My apologies, we were running slightly over on the first one. If I could just start off by saying, obviously, the purpose of this committee is to look at the government's proposed legislation on online safety, and in particular, for this panel to discuss the prevalence of abusive behaviour towards sports stars, footballers in particular. But of course, our focus is defined by the bill, which is looking at online abuse, and we would not, at the start of this, pretend that racist abuse only exists in online environments. And obviously, scenes that we see consistently within football stadia are a particular cause of concern, and not about online environments, but about real and physical environments. I wonder if I could ask Rio Ferdinand, if I could ask you first. And there are over 100 men, or non-white men, who have represented the England national men's football team. And yet, despite that, not even that status can protect people from the personal abuse that they can receive, particularly on social media. Given your career, how disappointing is it to you that we still remain in this position where this scourge of racist abuse directed towards footballers that we may have thought once upon a time as a feature of life in the 70s and 80s is still something that affects players today?
Thanks for having me here, first and foremost. Listen, it baffles me. It's disheartening. In the 70s and 80s, it was something that was a lot more common. We went through a period where maybe it was under the carpet or it was behind the scenes a little bit more, but now you can see the data is telling us that it's here and it's back. And we saw again in the Euros, the aftermath when the three black players missed penalties. What happened then? It's obviously disappointing, but at the same time, when those three black players for England missed those penalties, the first thing I thought was, let's see what happens on social media. And I know I expected what happened to happen, and that's the disappointing thing. And so when that is your mindset immediately after a black player who is representing the country, who is doing great things, and they make not a mistake, but they miss a penalty, and they have to sit there and go through the abuse in the coming days via social media. It's totally disheartening, and that's where it comes to our point, and to well, we're here in terms of talking on the behalf of the football community, in that the players shouldn't have to go through this, and not only the players, but the people that are around them, their families, their friends, the various different types of supporters from all over the world, their children, and they're the important people in this as well, and the wider part of society and community that have to actually sit there and listen and see this. There's AI that is there for so many other different aspects on social media platforms. I've got a YouTube channel. We have copyright issues. If we put a particular video up that we haven't had copyright approval for, that works. We can't find it here for certain emojis or certain words or the terminologies that are used on social media platforms. That's baffling. The technology is there.
I think that's an extremely good point. I mean, I think all football fans will know if on a Saturday afternoon you want to try and find on Twitter a goal your team has scored, that pirated footage will be down within minutes.
100%. Exactly.
And so if the technology exists to do it, to remove pirated content, why can't it be used to remove abusive content? I mean, how disappointing for you is it that on the night after the England-Italy game, it wasn't just that individuals were posting comments that weren't being removed, accounts were posting content and those accounts weren't being closed down, but that the recommendation tools of those platforms were actually highlighting and drawing attention to terms of racial abuse as trending topics?
Well, yeah, exactly. And the perpetrators are allowed to stand behind a curtain at the moment. They're allowed to stand, they're allowed to post, these keyboard warriors are allowed to say and spout all this abuse from behind the curtain. They're anonymous. And that is an absolute problem for everybody in society. The fact that you can be anonymous online, like this is a good example we were speaking about before. You can go to a game, and if you threw a banana on a pitch, there'd be repercussions. But online, you can post a banana, you can type and post a banana to a black player, or a black person with racist connotations behind it and be fine. And you're not going to get punished. There's no repercussions. How is that right? It can't be.
And you may have comments on this as well, but to ask Sanjay and Adeline as well. I mean, it seems that these incidents are getting are consistent, that complaints have been raised consistently over the last 2 or 3 years over major incidents directed towards a series of players. I think the incident, Paul Pogba, that was the beginning of I think probably 2 years ago, I think that incident took place. And yet we don't seem to get an adequate response from the companies. They don't seem to be good at removing the accounts, removing the posts, anticipating likely incidents. And what has your experience been of dealing with the social media companies and raising these concerns with them?
I think first, again, just to reiterate what Rio said, we're really delighted to be here today giving evidence on behalf of football. I think it's really important to flag that from a football perspective, we've been engaging with social media organisations for years now, and what we consistently receive are platitudes. We get promises of things that are going to be addressed. We get told that, of course, racism, discrimination of any kind is a priority. And actually what we are seeing is that online abuse is a golden goose for social media organisations. They are able to amplify messages. They are able to make sure that the reach is broad, far and wide. And actually, they're not tackling the problem that we're seeing across the entire football landscape. As Rio mentioned, this isn't just players and their families, but it's coaches, it's administrators, it's referees, it's everybody involved in the game. And indeed, it's not just football. So what we're seeing from social media companies is significant resistance, is a desire to just focus on a business model and making money. And actually, it's a mechanism by which they are not putting in place the protections that are so desperately needed in the online space.
And thank you, Chair, as well, for the invitation to speak, and grateful to have the opportunity to help to really drive some change here, because that's really what I want to focus on, is the solutions. And this sort of revolutionary bill, and we'd be the first globally to do this, as I think Imran said in his previous session, is a real opportunity. We really must seize this opportunity. I think in terms of the types of harm that we're talking about, I think Adeline and Rio talked really well about, the challenges Rio's seen as a player, and Adeline about some of the other. But this is not just about elite players. It goes all the way down to grassroots and journalists and coaches and fans. It's everyone. It's the people you don't see, not just the elite players. I think we also have to remember that racism doesn't travel alone. And what we actually see is the sort of 4 horsemen of the apocalypse of hate. And so we see hate based on race, on gender and sexual orientation, on disability, and on religion. And what's the response of social media? Well, look, I've been in this round for 2 years, having these conversations with them. I think others have been in the conversations for 3 and 4 years. My experience is that we'll have conversations in London, and it will be London says, oh, that's interesting, maybe. And then California says no. And so I'm not sure whether I'm stuck in Groundhog Day or Dante's Inferno. But either way, it's a deeply unpleasant experience.
And that's why the committee is here, to try and find a way out of that hell. Just finally from me, I mean, are you concerned, Rio Ferdinand, are you concerned that the prevalence of this speech, this content, this dehumanizing language on social media is giving license to racists, effectively, to speak out, to seek other people of similar opinions, and to act in a concerted way to deliberately target and dehumanize sports stars like footballers?
100%, I agree with that. I think it's normalizing racist behavior. It's normalizing racist language. If you put it in a context of a young person who supports, admires a certain player, whatever level that is, whatever football club they support, and he's looking through that feed and seeing racist language, or that player now is not his favourite player because he missed a penalty maybe, and he's seeing the racist language that is now being put towards that person that he's now not in favour, that normalises that type of language. So that young person then goes into his network of friends, either on social media platforms or face to face, and he's seen it, and it's not been, there's no repercussions for that for the person who put that online. It's fine, it's normal. So I'll do that at school, and I'll say it at school. It's okay. When there's no repercussions, there's nothing going to be done to actually put that person in place, put that person in the spotlight, take them from behind that curtain to expose them as to who they are, spouting this ridiculous language, ignorant language, then people are going to find it and think it's normal. And I think I don't know what other industries there are in the world where it's okay to spout such language and be okay and get away with it and be able to hide behind the curtain as we do online.
Ian Russell.
Thank you, Chair. If I may address you, Mr. Ferdinand, in the first instance. What we don't often hear is the real human impact of this. And I wondered if you'd mind expanding on the impact this awful abuse has had on you and other players, but also on families, because I often find in our position, in public positions, it's my family and friends who are most offended and hurt by what people might be saying about me as a politician. Would you mind expanding on that and tell some of those stories, please?
Well, when you sit at home and you on one of these devices that we've all got and that are in our hands probably 80% of the day, 90% of the day, and you look on there and there's negative discrimination on there, and that language is there and prominent for you to see. Self-esteem, your mental health is at risk, and it all depends as well sometimes where you are in your life. And some people are at a low ebb anyway, and then to see that as well just has further impact. Everybody receives this type of discriminative language very differently, but it does hurt. And again, it's important to stress it's not just about that person, it's the wider network of that person, what it does to them, friends and family. Me personally, I've seen members of my family kind of disintegrate at times with situations like this when it happens. I've seen other sports stars, family members take it worse than the actual person who's actually receiving this type of language through social media. And I think it's hard sometimes for people to understand. And some people say, oh yeah, but it's only coming on the phone, just ignore it, turn it off. And that's what a lot of the social media platforms say when you speak to them. It's down to the victim to report it or put the blocks in place through turning certain things off on your device so you don't see it. Well, that's not stopping the problem, is it? And I think that's an easy cop-out for the social media platforms when they put forward ideas like that in the way that we can kind of quash this situation.
And if I may ask just on that point, you mentioned about your YouTube channel and copyright and the profiteering that happens from advertising and so on. Do you think that Facebook, Twitter, these channels are effectively profiting from prejudice as it currently stands?
I think they do. I think Imran spoke very well and eloquently about that before. Any type of conversation is profitable and is good for these companies. I'm a part of that ecosystem in terms of producing content that you want to be shared and liked. But if it's wrong, I think there needs to be things in place to make sure that it is dealt with properly and there are the repercussions in place. And just to go back to the point I was talking about before, about experiences, and like a big impact as well when these social media messages come through online, the hate online comes through to you as an individual. A lot of us have children, and I have to sit there and have breakfast with my kids and explain to them what the monkey emoji means in that context, what a banana means. Dad, why is there banana under your post? Why is there those? What's that about? And me having to do that in today's day and age when there's AI and resources available for these companies to be able to deal with these situations, so that I as a parent don't have to go down this road and explain that. You'd like to think that these people would put those things in place.
And finally, if I may, for time, I've been very fortunate. I'm Watford MP, so I've got to know Luther Blissett very well, incredible legend of England and Watford. And he's told me stories of what it was like in the 80s, you know, the awful chanting in crowds and how especially black players broke through those barriers and we'd got to what seemingly a much better place over the past few years. Do you think we're going backwards now with what's happening on social media? Is that starting to be seen more in crowds in terms of fan bases and so on?
Yeah, the data's telling us that. I get access, luckily and fortunately, to various pieces of data, and that's what it's telling us. The police force are telling us that. And I think it's just a knock-on effect from it's okay online, so it must be okay in the stadiums. Until you sort those situations out online, I think it's going to keep on being reflected in the stadiums. I'm now at the moment part of a case I was racially abused at a game recently. So I know from personal experience, it's becoming more normal.
Thank you for sharing those stories. Thank you.
Thank you. Tim Clement-Jones.
Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you for coming today. Rio, you were talking earlier about the ability of abusers to hide behind a curtain. And Edley, in the FA evidence, and we've spoken about this previously, you go with some detail about the identity verification aspect. It isn't so much that you're in favor of, if you like, compulsory verification, but you believe in limiting the reach of a user who doesn't verify. Is that right? Is that the approach, do you think, that should be taken in the bill?
I think it's fair to say that when we think about verification, social media organisations would have us believe that it's a binary option and an on-off switch whereby people either have to provide all information or no information. And I think what we believe is actually that there are multiple layers and multiple mechanisms that can be used in combination to help tackle this issue. So ID verification is one element, default settings could be another, the limiting of reach could be another. And the reason why we think it has to be a layering is because when we look at the volume of abuse that is received across the world of football, we see that a lot of the abuse is coming from burner accounts, whereby people set up an account, send abusive messages, delete an account, and are able to re-register another account within moments. Now, actually, if there was some limitation on what could be done with a brand new account, say a cooling off period, or if there were mechanisms by which there were certain default settings, we think that that would act as a level of deterrent to individuals who are currently setting up burner accounts and abusing people in this way. So it's not a binary situation. We do recognise that there are some instances and for some individuals where, of course, a level of anonymity is something that we have to recognise is important. But we don't think that the current stance that social media are taking and then feigning complete ignorance about the issues around anonymity, as Rio's talked about, are where we can start. We think this bill has to address this challenge.
And would you go for that, Rio, for that more nuanced approach rather than insisting on everyone revealing identity when they post?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think there'll be some people who have various different reasons why they wouldn't want, for safety, etc., why they wouldn't want everything exposed immediately from the get-go. I think the layers to it and the entry points is definitely a starting point.
And Sanjay?
I think ultimately the system at the moment, and this is really about systems and processes, the system is too frictionless. It's too easy for someone to just turn up and abuse someone. And look, we have to remember that the online world and abuse is not someone standing on Speaker's Corner at Hyde Park and shouting abuse into the ether. This is 150 people in a Twitter pitchfork mob turning up in your living room and spitting abuse in your eyes, whilst your family are next door, unable to do anything about it. That's the problem that we're dealing with, and that's the problem that we need to address. So we need to add more friction into the system with all the sort of mechanisms that we've talked about. And I think the answer in terms of the legislative framework is to give Ofcom the power to introduce codes of practice around the reach of anonymous accounts so that that can be managed on an ongoing basis. It's also a dynamic environment. We are not legislating for the world as it is now. We also have to legislate for the world as it is going to be, and we can't anticipate all of those changes. So the best thing to do is to give Ofcom the power to do that.
Actually, on that point, I know Wilf Stevenson wanted to come in on Ofcom. Could I call Wilf remotely?
Yes, I'm sorry for appearing remotely, but thank you very much for the evidence so far. You said that you hoped that we would be looking for solutions, and obviously one of those will be in some form a regulatory authority that will be able to put some muscle behind the aspirations we have for change, much of which we've discussed today. If we're going to avoid Groundhog Day, what do you think is the way forward in terms of Ofcom? Do you think it has the authority, the capacity, and the focus that you've been identifying as being lacking at the moment? I think all of you can respond.
Maybe I'll take it in the first instance on the basis that I had a 30-year career in law and compliance, so it might be, yeah. it might be up my Strasser. So
you can make it a job application if you want.
Go and work for Ofcom.
My CV is available. Look, I'll go back to the start. This is an amazing opportunity that we're facing here in the UK to be a global leader. We'll be the first to go. But of course, the corollary of being the first to go is that there is no rule book. There's no precedent that we can go and just cut and paste and implement. I think you have to give that power. It's sensible to give those powers to an existing regulator, and of the existing regulators, Ofcom's by far the most sensible one because it's used to regulating similar companies, the telecommunications companies. Social media are different to telecoms, but they're probably the nearest analog. And so I think taking all of that experience that Ofcom have of regulating the telecoms industry is probably a sensible place to start. I think it then comes down to, pace, power, and energy, right? In football terms, get on with it quickly, give them the right powers, not just the powers to enforce, but you have to give them those powers to supervise. My experience in other heavily regulated industries where I've spent my career is that it's actually the supervisory powers that tend to be the most effective, the ability to call for robust data transparency to deal with the sort of volatile data that we have at the moment. You need that robust data to enable you to evolve interventions over time. And it's exactly right in the same way that the Financial Conduct Authority has that power to call for information, that the Ofcom also have those robust transparency reporting requirements, along with other powers that we've talked about in our paper. And then I think in terms of energy, it is give them the resources, and that means investing in them and maybe hiring people from the social media companies, having poachers turn gamekeeper. And we've got a track record, haven't we? All of those heavily regulated industries, banking, life sciences, utilities, telecoms, energy, they were once upon a time, they were all in their regulatory infancy, and we're in our regulatory infancy. This is the time to invest the resources.
Could I just follow that up a little bit? Because I think all you've said is very heartening, and you seem to have picked up the issues that will be required. But underpinning all this is this duty of care approach, which of course is different. It doesn't set the parameters exactly. It encourages a dialogue and a debate. So the regulator is not just there to police; it's also there to assess and to provide standards that will be sustainable and, as you pointed out, may need to change as we go forward. Do you think that is the right approach?
I think the framework is right with the escalating duties of care and with the, I'm aware from the sort of competition law and the privacy areas that the scaling of fines relevant to turnover is a good enforcement mechanism. I think it comes back to the point about we're in a dynamic environment, and so what a regulator needs is the power to be able to call for the data to enable them to evolve. And a regulator isn't just about enforcement. An effective regulator is also about supervising and avoiding the problems happening in the first place, not just, closing the door after closing the stable door after the horse has bolted. At the moment, online abuse is like being constantly punched in the face, and it's no comfort to me to say we're going to arrest the person who punched me in the face. I would rather you stop someone from punching me in the face in the first place.
So there's an educational element as well.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chairman.
Yeah, I think that's, sorry to interrupt. I think that was a key point. The last words that we used there is education. I think everyone's looking for solutions, which is fine and great. We do need that, and I think there has to be punishments that are set out. But I think education has to be a key part of any type of reform, any type of punishment, because without that, then I think we'll just be back to square one again. People will just accept the punishments, right, and back online again and go again. And I think that the educating of the next generation, but also people of our ages in this room, to understand that there's new languages, there's new ways of being speaking, there's new ways of actually communicating now, and via social media. So you have to be careful, but you have to be very aware. But you've got to be made aware, and education is definitely a way forward with that.
So I think, as you said earlier on, if a person's experience, if they're being educated through their experience, and their experience is that racist abuse exists and spreads without any kind of control, then I think as you said earlier on, it gives the impression that actually this is acceptable, even when it is clearly not. Jim Knight.
I want to pick up directly on that. The bill has one clause on media literacy in terms of the duties on Ofcom. Do you think that is sufficient in terms of education? The Football Authority evidence talked about the work that it does on education. Should the bill is silent on anything to do with schools, anything to do with the Department for Education? Should the bill do more on education?
I think the reality is that we recognise that to tackle this problem, it is going to need a multi-pronged approach. As it relates specifically to this bill, we recognise that actually social media organisations are not putting out the hate that we see because there are individuals who are uneducated sitting behind a computer, and that's having a significant impact. Let's be clear, the messages are being amplified on those platforms, and that is having the significant impact and the significant reach. This isn't an individual level problem. When we look at the scale of this abuse that we're seeing on social media platforms, it's millions of posts each and every day. Now, yes, education is absolutely one part of it, particularly as we look at the younger generation and the children growing up who are now engaging and using social media platforms more. But I think we have to be honest in saying the responsibility at the moment as it relates to this bill has got to lie with how can we hold social media organisations to account so that they are not amplifying these messages when they do take place, and that we have a systems and process solution so that we're not putting a band-aid over a bullet wound. And at the moment, that's what we're doing, right? We have community standards where social media organisations themselves define what can and can't be in place and what people can and can't see. And we've seen that that's not enforced to the level that we need to protect all users on online platforms. So yes, I recognise that education is one part of it, and I think education is part of tackling societal discrimination, but let's not use that as the out or the excuse for what we're seeing on social media platforms at the moment.
Thank you. Susan Webb.
Thank you. I think I may have inadvertently photobombed you coming actually onto the estate earlier. So many apologies when you view photos and videos. It's before you arrived, but I have a feeling that I may be in that video. But hey, there's a really nice link. So all's well that actually ends well. I'm going to go back to the duty of care and sort of really back to Ofcom. You kind of said there's no rule book and there's no precedent. You've also talked about the band-aid over a bullet wound. What I'm really conscious of is whatever we do, we make it right. It's being talked about that this is a revolutionary bill. Those were your words. The previous evidence talked about this being an ambitious bill. As I say, we're very, very keen to get this right. So do you think the duty of care by the platforms actually goes far enough? Does the bill actually identify that? Is it going to fix the problem? Or are we going to sort of start talking about legislation further down the road, where we need to keep focusing on this? And so basically you talked about, has it got the right powers and the supervision powers as well? My concern, and I think we touched upon it earlier, that the platforms will be marking their own homework effectively. And that is a great concern to me. As politicians, we also are on the receiving end of a huge amount of abuse and unnecessary abuse, and sort of empathise and sympathise very much with the impact. So I think we're all in this room very, very keen to get it right. So, is the duty of care on platforms, is it going to fix the problem?
So I think as we look at the bill as it stands at the moment, we recognise that there are a number of elements that are addressed, but we as football believe that, of course, it can be enhanced and strengthened to make sure that it actually addresses the problem that we're here discussing. Of course, if we look at, the fact that this is new, as Sanjay said, that does not take away from the fact that there is some precedent in legislation at the moment that we think could be applied to this bill. So to use one example, we already have protection for groups identified as at risk under existing legislation with the Equality Act. Actually, we think that should be mirrored in this bill as an example, so that the discriminatory abuse that Rio's talked about and others have talked about can be mitigated, and we're not seeing it on online platforms because social media organisations are held to account. We also think, as Sanjay said, that Ofcom should be given powers on content, and content that is harmful in the broadest sense, right? So not just content that is illegal, but also legal content that is harmful. And we absolutely recognise how difficult it is to define and clarify what legal but harmful means. But let's be clear, we think that Parliament is absolutely the best place to make that definition versus within social media organisation boardrooms, because from what we've seen from terms and conditions and community standards thus far, it doesn't go far enough and it doesn't address the issues at hand. I think there are a number of elements that we think can be further enhanced as it relates to the current bill. And actually on the legal but harmful piece, one of the discussions we were having this morning is that actually there is some precedent. So I'm going to hand over to Sanjay because I think it's important for him to give that stance and give some context there.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes people think the legal but harmful, that feels like a big grey area and how do you legislate for that? Well, actually, we've got some jurisprudence from elsewhere. So, you know, there is a civil law cause of action in conspiracy, and conspiracy has two limbs. Lawful means conspiracy or unlawful means conspiracy. So you can actually conspire by lawful means and be held to be civilly responsible for that. And that goes back to 1940s, and then was clarified in the Lonhro and Fayed litigation in the late 80s, early 90s, and there's been a rich history of that sort of economic tort. The two key defining characteristics are was there harm experienced? In this case, yes, tick, there is harm experienced. Was it intended? Was it aimed? If you send a monkey emoji at a footballer, that's pretty clearly intended to cause harm. So we have precedent, we have jurisprudence. Actually, we just need to look at that jurisprudence from elsewhere and bring that into this harmful content, because I think it is achievable.
Thank you. Darren Jones.
Thank you, Chair. I'm interested in this discussion between the balance in the bill between content moderation and consequences for individuals. We've talked about both today. The bill doesn't really deal with anonymity or being able to find the person who tweeted something and provide a consequence for that action, but it does deal with content moderation. I was interested the government said in July that they were going to extend football banning orders, for example, to abuse on social media. But I don't really understand how they can do that if you can't identify who the person is that tweeted the racist abuse in the first place. So I'm just interested in your views from each of you, if that's okay, as to whether you think this bill is doing the right thing in trying to deal with content moderation first, and we should focus on getting that right, and then maybe try to deal with anonymity and individual consequences second. Or whether you think it should all be included and we therefore need to see some quite fundamental reform to the draft bill as it stands.
I think both, if I'm being honest. I think doing one without the other, I think is you're harming yourself doing that. You're holding back on one area and trying to sort out another. I think the anonymity is a key part of it. You need to understand and see who people are. I think when people are made to be visible, they maybe think twice, and their life could change if they are now out in the open and it's exposed who they are and what they've been spouting. And I think that is a key part of it. But I think they go hand in hand. And I think that the content to be vetted and to be understood by the social media companies. I think to the point before, I think the social media companies have proved that had they got the intentions, the desire to deal with discriminative online hate effectively, efficiently and quickly, I think their actions have been proven that it's not really at the top of their list of to-do things. So I think the government legislation, will be a key part in actually making sure if we get it right and the amendments are made and they're done right, that they'll have to. Thank you.
I was just going to say, I think we should be really careful not to sort of think in a unitary way that there's only one problem and one solution. Part of the challenge here is that it's multifactorial and the problems are interconnected. And I think we probably have to deal with all of those issues, but I don't think that requires enormous substantial changes to the bill, because I think it's about how do you delegate the right power and authority to Ofcom to ensure that it has the ability to evolve regulation and its rules and codes of practice to meet a dynamic industry. That's exactly what we do, regulators do in other industries, and this is the most dynamic industry, right? You could have Twitter or Facebook could be out of business in 5 years' time because a competitor has come up and he's stolen its lunch. That's the way that industry works, and how are you going to deal with that? So again, we have to be, the world's greatest ice hockey player, Wayne Gretzky, when he's asked, why are you the greatest hockey player? He says, because I skate to where the puck is going to be. And we have to have that mentality here of thinking about where's the world moving to, not just deal with the snapshot of the problem as it is today.
I couldn't agree more. I think a key element, as Sanjay said, is to give Ofcom the powers to create those codes of practice. And part of that will be, or should be, on the reach of anonymous accounts, because I think, as Rio has said, the impact of the anonymity for a lot of people across the football space is significant. There is no singular intervention that is the panacea. It's going to be a combination of interventions that are going to lead us to the place where we have a solution that actually addresses the problem. And of course, we're here because we want to get to that place where we have a solution that protects all of the users from a social media perspective, and where our football players don't feel as though they're being bullied off of an online platform. They don't feel as though they're being told to sit in their front room and listen to people screaming in their eyeballs and are being told, just cover your ears, right? We want to get to a place where actually there's a tangible solution in place that addresses the issue. And in order for that to happen, we do think that there are some amendments that we would welcome seeing in the bill as it stands at the moment.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
I mean, just on that, so I think what you're saying is that the bill needs to address the question of the accountability of the account holders to the platform, so that they could be identified by the platform if they were behaving in an abusive way, and that the bill also needs to be prescriptive, certainly in the areas of harmful but not illegal, as to what should be within scope. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think the challenge that we see, if we think about social media organisations and some of the reports that they do put out, is they tell us that they are able to identify who is behind the abuse on their platforms. But as Sanjay has said, when you try to dig deeper and you ask them further questions on that data, it becomes clear quite quickly that actually they don't have the level of data that they are portraying. And so transparency reporting and that being tackled as part of the bill is of course really key and critical for us as well. And we've seen that post Euros. I was saying to both Rio and Sanjay this morning, I have some questions that I've asked social media organisations the morning after the final, and weeks on, I'm still waiting for responses to those questions. So if they have that data, it should be really easy.
If you've not already done so, I think we'd be quite interested in seeing what those questions are. We might ask them ourselves.
Yeah, more than happy to share.
Baroness Kidron, being Kidron, sorry.
Yeah, Evelyn, I really wanted to ask you, we've made this incredible leap in the women's game, and that hasn't really come up yet. And I just wonder how women are experiencing abuse, and in particular, how that affects young girls who perhaps don't have the tradition of thinking they might be footballers, and what that gap is.
I think it's really important to flag that this abuse is being received right from the top flight of the game and England players down to the grassroots, so including young women, including players in our impairment-specific pathways. I think as we think specifically about young women and the challenges that indeed lots of people face growing up, questioning identity, questioning self-esteem, and all the normal teenage angst, that is of course amplified when you are a player on social media who is then being abused for a characteristic that is just part of who you are. And to use an anecdote, we have had a number of players in the game recently who have experienced racist, discriminatory, misogynistic abuse, have reported that abuse, and the abuse has been so significant that at times they have been blocked by social media companies from reporting the volume of abuse they're receiving. So we have players in the professional game who actually are being halted because they've reported abuse too many times. And so what we have at the moment is a system whereby social media organisations protect the offenders more than they protect victims. And that for us is of course a significant problem.
So for absolute clarity, what's happening is that the victim is going to the social media company and they're saying, you are coming to us too many times, and that is the problem, not the abuse you're experiencing.
We have an anecdotal example of a specific player where that was their exact experience. They were blocked from reporting the abuse that they had consistently received, and it was then other individuals who had to get involved externally to help them report it.
Okay. I have another question, and it builds from what my colleague said, which is, after the game, I know that football went into number 10 and there were promises made. What were the promises and where's the gap? I mean, what is it that this bill has been promised to deliver football?
This bill has promised to deliver football, that the legislation that will be put into place will address this issue. And that's why, as it relates to the enhancement that we have asked for, we think they are critical if we actually want to address the issue. The bill as it stands at the moment, yes, addresses some of the issues, but it does not go all the way in tackling the problem that we're seeing across the football landscape.
Maybe if I could just add, because I think, within a couple of days of the Euros final, the Prime Minister promised to stop online racism, to stamp out, I think was the words he used, stamp out online racism. Now, we think that this is a good framework. But I think with the additional changes that we're suggesting, we think that gives us a better chance of meeting the Prime Minister's promise.
Thank you.
If I could underline, if there are, I mean, I appreciate that you submitted written evidence to the inquiry. If there are specific amendments to the bill you think should be made, we'd certainly be very interested in seeing those. John Nicholson.
Thank you very much, Chair. Rio, it was very depressing when you told us that it's like being back in the 1980s and it's all just back to the way it was then. I mean, I can't imagine what good person would want to throw a banana onto a football pitch or send monkey emojis. Who are these people in your experience?
From different backgrounds, from different walks of life. In my experience, you've seen it, it's sometimes been somebody who is a young schoolboy, ranging ages 13, 14 years old, sometimes younger.
Really?
Could be somebody who's an estate agent, could be somebody who's a banker. It's from all different types of lives, and that's the crazy thing is that you can't just pinpoint one type of person from a certain particular background and say that is the actual stereotypical racist who's putting this abuse online or at stadiums or wherever. It's a very varied demographic of people.
Are there lessons from the 80s to be learned in how we tackle it and make things better? Or is the world just so different because of social media that that's where we've got to focus?
I think the landscape is very different now. I think with social media, we've never been in this area. This time is very different. And again, you're allowed to be anonymous now, and that's the big difference. The fact that you can be anonymous online gives you a certain amount of power. It enables you to puff your chest out and then be able to really say what you really feel, especially compounded with the fact that there's no repercussions at the moment. So with all that, again, that I think drives the numbers up. And again, like I keep going back to that same point, the data we're being told by the police, etc., is that it is going up and it's becoming more prominent.
And having a knock-on effect to schools and elsewhere where we hoped and believed and the experience was things were getting better, language was improving, and you say that's all sliding backwards.
Yeah, sliding backwards. It got better. It never went away. I'm not sitting here saying that racism or discrimination had gone in all forms had gone away, but it seemed to have got to a point where you wasn't hearing and seeing it as much. But again,
kids now feel they've got license,
yeah,
because of what they see online.
Yeah, they're empowered.
Can I just pick up on that point about who's doing it?
Please.
Because it's a really important segue into the bit about data transparency. This is exactly the problem, right? What happens is we see an incident, we ask who's doing it, we have an absence of data, so we each fill that vacuum with our own prejudices and anecdotes. So we don't have data, we have anecdata, right? This is the reason why we need a regulator that has the power to call for data, to understand root causes, to understand who's doing this, where are they, why are they doing this, what are their age profiles, to understand which interventions are going to work. You could introduce a football banning order for online abusers, but that's only going to impact people in this country who go to matches or want to go to matches. I don't know if that's going to deal with 5% of the problem, 10% of the problem, 50% of the problem. And that's the challenge that we're dealing with. And the only way you're going to get that is if you have a regulator that's got the power to call for the data from the organizations that have it, which is social media. We've been attempting, banging our head against a brick wall for that data, and we're not getting it. So it needs to be mandated.
And let's be clear, just to add to what Sanjay said, as football, we have tried mechanisms to look at how we can overlay and get some information and get data using our own monitoring, being proactive in approach. And what we're finding is what social media organisations are telling us is happening and what we are finding does not correlate. And so it's a real significant problem as it relates to the data, because actually social media organisations might have you believe that football banning orders are going to solve all of the problems, because they might have you believe that all of the online abusers are indeed football fans who go to matches every weekend. That's not what the data that we found from a football perspective tells us. And so the importance of that data being correct, social media organisations not being able to mark their own homework or spin the statistics to tell the story that they would like it to tell, is a really, really critical one. Because even with the discussions we've been having with law enforcement and police, they similarly face a challenge as it relates to getting the relevant information out of social media organisations. There are delay tactics put in place. There's a kind of deferring and moving away from the specific asks of a question, and we need that to be addressed, and at the moment it isn't being.
Okay, that we've heard, and your message is very clear. Ms. Dunn, we've got Stonewall coming in after you. Now, in a previous committee session, I spoke to the then chief executive of the English Football Association, and he told me that he would not advise any footballer to come out as gay. His comments were very controversial. I thought he received a bit of a rough ride, and I don't think he intended to convey the message that some thought. I think he was saying that it just wasn't safe for footballers to come out. And he said that he didn't feel that the English Football Association could guarantee the safety of footballers if they came out.
No, just
nobody's come out since.
Answer that.
Yes.
I'm just shooting something around homophobia in football, and I've just met currently a player who had come out, and he was advised by a lawyer not to come out and speak. And I was like, wow, why you need to come out, and you need to speak and say your truth and be proud of who you are, etc.
You say who it is?
No, not now. It's not for me to say that. But
sorry, I thought you said he was coming out.
Yeah, I've spoken to him.
Wants to come out?
No, he's come out. I'll speak. Let me finish 1 second. Okay. And then what I'm trying to get at is that the reason why he's the lawyer, which I now understand why he advised him not to come out, is because every individual is very different, and you can't use a blanket approach. Every individual is at a different stage of their life in understanding themselves, their sexuality. And he advised him based on his experience with that individual. And he didn't think that he was strong enough mentally at that time and had the right pieces in place to be able to withstand the media attention, the spotlight, all of this, the different emotions that's going to come out and pressures to deal with that situation at that moment in time. So initially I thought it was I was quite put back about the advice, but after being explained to someone who's actually been through that process, I quite understood it.
Yeah, because of course everybody's different, and people shouldn't be pressurised into coming out when they're not ready to. But to go back to the FA, what the chief executive was saying was that the FA couldn't provide a duty of care to footballers who wanted to come out, because we all know their footballers are out with their families and their friends and their teammates, and other folk in the club know that they're gay, and they're having to hide because they don't feel safe. That's an extraordinary position to be in the 21st century. So I ask you again, would that still be the FA's position, that they don't feel they can protect a footballer who wants to come out?
I think it's important to say that the FA are doing everything that we can to make sure that we are creating a culture of inclusivity for all individuals, irrespective of background, irrespective of sexual orientation, race, religion, or anything else. We're proactively striving to make sure that all players, all participants across our game feel as though they are welcome, are respected, and feel a sense of belonging. And we are working with the various football leagues, the various football clubs, to make sure that we are having that engagement. We are having education sessions. We are talking about campaigns and making sure that we're clear that our message is that football is absolutely for all. As part of any employer's duty, there is a duty of care. And so we do continue to work with clubs and leagues to make sure that any employee that works for them, so a player who works for a club, is supported and has that duty of care, has that well-being support, and anything else that they might need.
Sorry, but it's self-evidently not working, because there's not a single out player. And there's no other sport that I can think of where that's the case, where there's no out players. And we all know there's a lot of gay people in the world, so including several members of this committee, like myself. So
Can I
isn't it extraordinary? Just to finish the point for a second, I'll bring you back in. Isn't it extraordinary that that's still the case? And I'm not blaming the FA necessarily for it, but it must say something about the type of bullying that gay people are scared about as footballers. It must say something about the reaction they're expecting to get on social media, that they don't feel they can live their real lives and be open in sport. And my goodness, if as a wealthy footballer, you don't feel that you can come out, what message does that send to a kid living in a housing scheme who's being bullied every day?
I think if you look at it from a different angle, I think you might come to a different way of thinking. I think that when you look at the usual examples of the other sports, rugby players, divers, who most recently, in those sports, the spotlight maybe isn't as strong on those sports, and the attention and the pressures. Yes, it's still a huge announcement when you're releasing that information to the public, but then. And I'm not saying that the football's a bigger and better sport, but I'm just saying the amount of eyeballs and the amount of attention and press pages that they're going to get as a footballer is so much more, is so much bigger. And then the responsibility on that person to come out, and just because you're wealthier maybe, and that you've got more followers on social media and you're in a more prominent sport like football, doesn't mean that you're somebody who's actually capable of dealing with all that attention still. So I think it's very, very much about the individual person and not about the sport. It's about, are you capable of coming out and being able to withstand that media attention?
Is that why it's different in the women's game, where there are plenty of out footballers, but not in the men's game?
Yeah, I'd say so. It's more commonplace. And again, like you say, exactly to that point, that the media attention for a female player to come out as gay and being open, the attention on that is far different if it was a man's game, and especially if it was one of the elite players at the elite football clubs. It's very different. I think they should all feel, we get to a point, hopefully, when everybody's as confident as they can be, that they know and they see that the support mechanisms are behind the scenes, and with the FA are trying to really get in place.
Well, in closing, before I hand back to the chair, I mean, I would have to say, Ms. John, I don't believe it's because all of the gay footballers in football are fragile or emotionally unprepared or any of the other reasons. A lot of them will have been through a journey, and they're adult men, probably many of them in happy relationships with strong support structures. There's something unique about football at the moment, and the level of abuse that they fear that they'll get because they see what's happened to black players. I suspect they're just terrified about it, and that's a very sad place for us to be. Chair.
I think we have to just acknowledge that for every individual in any circumstance, it is up to them to decide how and when they come out. I think the responsibility of us as football, as the authorities and the organisations, is to make sure that we are trying to create an environment where people do feel supported, do feel as if they can come out and do feel safe. And that, of course, is a priority for all of our organisations across football, and indeed is a key strategic priority and objective. As you say, the online space at the moment is where a lot of individuals do receive abuse when they may come out, for example. And actually, that's why we're here talking about this legislation today, because it's the responsibility of all of us in this room to make sure that that is also a safe space, so that footballers can come out if they want to.
If I may, quite a few members got follow-up questions they want to ask, and Lord Gilbert's been very patiently waiting to come in for his questions as well. John Nicholson and I were involved in an inquiry a few years ago looking at homophobia in sport. I remember then that we had a number of people said that sports stars play at elite level in big stadium in front of crowds, that you learn to sort of zone out the sort of white noise of what people are saying in the stadium, because if you can't do that, you can't cope with the job you've been asked to do. And I just want to ask Rio, from a player's perspective, do you agree with that? And therefore, in an age of social media, does social media make that worse? Because the abuse, rather than being a voice in a crowd that you learn to try and ignore, it's actually it's something that's been directed to you in the palm of your hand.
It's a great point. And I think you can, as a player, in my experience, and I'm not talking about homophobic abuse or racist abuse, any type of abuse, at a stadium, that gets switched off after 90 minutes. I go home, it's finished, and I'm out of the way now. I'm in my own house, chilling with my family, it's fine. and you don't hear it. It has an after effect, yes, but it's not visible and it's not there live for me to see. But now with phones and different types of tablets and access to media, it's there 24/7, and you can't hide and get away from it, and that's a fact. And so it's very, very different in that sense. It's hard to deal with, but players, male, female, different sexualities, different races, it's a difficult place to be when, like, players from yesteryear, as I said to you, it was you could kind of deal with the situation there and then and really kind of harden yourself to it. Now it's very difficult. And the bigger, wider problem to that as well is like I spoke about before, is your wider network of friends and family and work friends that take on that form of discrimination as well.
Even Gilbert.
It's just a quick question, actually. I just want clarity about one of the things you're very specifically asking for in this bill. I think the question is probably for Sanjay. So the things you've been describing, some of the behaviour you've been describing is illegal and ought to be dealt with, and the duty of care requiring platforms to take down illegal content. I don't know about you, I'm reasonably optimistic that that's substantial progress. Some of it is not illegal. And you said you would like it much clearer on the face of the bill, a much clearer definition on the face of the bill of harmful content that incorporates the kind of material that you're describing, the kind of behaviour that you're describing. It seems to be there are two ways of doing that. Either describing that on the face of the bill as content that is harmful but is still legal, and therefore it gets captured by the duty of care, or just stop pussyfooting around and make it illegal. And which of those approaches do you favour?
Neither. I'm suggesting something in the middle, which is because the approach that you've suggested is static. That doesn't deal with the dynamism of evolving language and the evolving language of social media. If we just froze in time what is happening now and the abuse we see now, we'll be back asking for more primary legislation every time people change their behaviour online. That won't work. What we need to do, what I think we need to do, and we'll happily come back with some more detailed suggestions, is that you need to give Ofcom the power to regulate harmful but on its face legal content. So we'll give you an example. I think our guiding light in this should be the abuse that the three players received after the UEFA Euro 2020 final, because the unified public condemnation of that says to us that what the public are demanding is that each and every piece of hate that was spat out that night needs to be taken off the platforms. So actually, we should be measuring the effectiveness of this bill by looking at each and every single piece of content going, is this caught? Is this caught? Is this caught? And my fear at the moment is that it wouldn't be. And that the way in which to do that is to give a regulator the power to reflect contemporary social mores and contemporary social practices as to the kind of offensive behaviour that goes on, and to require that social media companies have policies that address those.
Are you slightly uncomfortable with giving that societal judgment to a regulator rather than Parliament? I mean, isn't it Parliament's job to make those societal calls?
I think it's a balancing act. It is, and it's, of course, this would be delegated authority from Parliament, and we might need to put some checks and balances in.
You talked about those checks and balances, because it seems to me they would be important.
And we could, and again, I'm very happy for us to come back and think about in a bit more detail about what those checks and balances might be. But ultimately, this is, we also have to balance against dealing with an evolving problem. And we can't legislate through the rear view mirror. We've got to legislate through the windscreen. We've got to see the problems that are coming up in front of us, not just going, well, that's the problem from last year, we've solved that. Well, so what? People have moved on. And my experience from other areas is, I practiced in the sort of fraud arena, not as a fraudster, but, we were experts in the fraud before last. Because by the time we got onto it, they were onto something else. And so this is the challenge here, you know, particularly when we're dealing with young people, they communicate in different ways. Okay, it might be a monkey emoji now, or it might be a banana emoji. If you just say, well, we'll make that illegal in this context, they'll move on to something else. And then they'll find some other way. And this is the challenge. If you freeze it in time, you don't have the dynamism to be able to build with that. So there isn't a perfect answer, and we have to find a balance between having appropriate parliamentary oversight, but also giving appropriate delegated authority to a regulator to deal with evolving problems as they emerge. But we do that in other areas. We do that in banking. We do that in life sciences. We do that in utilities. All I'm asking is you give the regulator the same powers that those other regulators have.
So on that point, I mean, a lot of what you're describing there sounds like the effective enforcement of the Equalities Act online.
Absolutely. Parliament has already decided that there are vulnerable groups that are worthy of protection. We just need to extend that protection into this legislation.
And recognise the context in some of those circumstances. So to your point that you just made around the monkey emoji, I can understand that if I'm referring to my child, I might call them a cheeky monkey, and that actually has terms of endearment and a very different reference to a monkey emoji being aimed at a black footballer who I have no relationship with, no connectivity with, after they've just missed a penalty in a football match.
Yeah.
And these are contextual analytics businesses. Guess what? This is their business. They can do that.
Yeah, exactly. Stephen Kidron.
Sanjay, I just want to find a little missing piece between what the chair's just said about the Equalities Act and your very clear ask for the regulator to have these powers. Do we need to also put a duty on the regulator to investigate and undertake to uphold the Equalities Act? I mean, there's one thing having powers, yeah? There's another thing using those powers. And it's either maybe another safety objective of the bill, or maybe it's somewhere where we're instructing the regulator. But I'd just like your view on that little gap that I see developing.
I think it would make sense to have the regulator do that.
Susan, did you have a final question?
I do. I just sort of following up exactly what you said, Chair, and yourself, is the simple fact that none of us were born as racist, none of us were born as sexist, none of us were born as misogynist. And so what I see these platforms doing is actually creating a conditioning of people to believe and think that way. We've worked so hard with the Equalities Act and so forth. So that was really my point. And it's really up to, if the platforms are watching, it's up to them to do something about it, not to create future generations of misogynist, sexist people and racist people. We've worked so hard to try and eliminate as much as we can. That was really my point.
Just finally, I was going to ask Adeline, as you'll have a sort of international relations function at the Football Association. I mean, are these discussions the FA has with your counterparts at FIFA and UEFA? And do you think there might be a concerted effort by the wider football family to put pressure on the tech companies to do more in this space?
It's fair to say that even if we look at the recent social media boycott that took place earlier this year, we engaged with our counterparts in the international space. So we had FIFA and UEFA supporting our social media boycott, and indeed we had some individual country FAs who also supported us. It's a topic that I think we care about across the entire landscape of football, so not just English football, but we absolutely recognise that different countries are in different spaces and are facing different challenges, and that's why the ongoing dialogue is really critical, but also why a lot of the international community are looking to us and this opportunity that we have to put in place the first piece of legislation that will be relevant, that can become a blueprint for other organisations, but indeed for other countries as well.
Yeah. Also, I mean, international governing bodies sanction countries for the consequence of the behaviour of their fans, and in countries like Hungary, we've seen that. I mean, are these discussions being had at kind of an executive level at UEFA and FIFA, as far as you're aware?
We absolutely have conversations right to the top of the organisations around discrimination, around online abuse, around sanctions, and around what we can do as a collective of football to make it clear that this isn't something that we want in our game and that our game is for all.
I think you're right. That concludes our questions. Thank you for your evidence.
Thank you.